There is a particular kind of silence that only comes with age, not the silence of someone who has nothing left to say, but the silence of someone who has spent decades choosing their words with surgical precision. Tom Brokaw, who turned 86 in 2024, has lived inside that kind of silence for a long time when it comes to the current state of the institution he helped build. But lately, that silence has cracked open. And what has come out of it is something the television industry wasn't entirely expecting. A genuine, unguarded admiration for the woman now anchoring the desk he once called home, Savannah Guthrie. This isn't a story about rivalry or old guard resentment, though both would make for easy drama. This is actually something rarer and in many ways more interesting, the story of one broadcasting legend recognizing the legitimacy, the grit, and the particular brilliance of another. Tom Brokaw didn't grow up in a world that looked anything like the one Savannah Guthrie navigates every single morning. He came from a different era of journalism, one with different rules, different expectations, and a fundamentally different relationship between the anchor and the audience. And yet, watching from a distance, he has come to see in Savannah something that transcends era and format. He has come to see a professional who is doing something genuinely difficult and doing it, by most measures, extraordinarily well. To understand why Brokaw's words about Guthrie carry the weight that they do, you first have to understand what Tom Brokaw actually represented, and still represents, in the landscape of American broadcast journalism. He wasn't simply an anchor. He was, for a generation of Americans, the voice through which history was processed and understood. When something happened in the world, something seismic, something that altered the course of nations, Brokaw was the man who told you about it, and in telling you, made it real. That is a peculiar and enormous form of power, and Brokaw wielded it with a steadiness that very few people in the history of television journalism have matched. He grew up in Yankton, South Dakota, the son of a construction foreman, in a part of the country where the values were direct and the winters were merciless. There was nothing soft or circumstantial about his path into journalism. It was driven by a genuine hunger to be where things were happening, and to be the person who explained those things to people who couldn't be there themselves. He worked his way through local stations, developed his craft with the kind of patient, unglamorous labor that the industry no longer makes room for, and eventually landed at NBC, where he would spend the better part of his career. By the time he became anchor of NBC Nightly News in 1982, he had already done more reporting from more corners of the world than most journalists manage in a lifetime. But it was the 1980s and 1990s that cemented his place in history. He was on the ground in Berlin in November of 1989 when the wall came down, a moment so pivotal, so world-altering, that the images from that night are still shown in classrooms today. Brokaw understood in real time that he was watching one of those rare events that changes everything that comes after it. His broadcasts that week were not just journalism, they were a form of witness. He stood at the intersection of history and ordinary human experience and helped millions of people understand what they were seeing. That is what the best broadcast journalism has always been about, and Brokaw did it as well as anyone who has ever sat in front of a camera. He also wrote The Greatest Generation, his celebrated account of the men and women who lived through the Great Depression and fought in World War II. The book became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that ordinary people, under extraordinary pressure, are capable of extraordinary things. It was a very Brokaw kind of project, serious, rooted in research and interviews, shaped by a genuine reverence for sacrifice and service. It told you something important about the man behind the desk, that he understood history not as a parade of great names, but as the accumulated weight of ordinary lives. When that book came out in 1998, it spent years on the bestseller lists. It also reinforced something about Brokaw that the television camera already suggested. This was a man who took the world seriously. The journalism world Brokaw came up through was a different planet from the one we live in now. The evening news was an event. You didn't consume it, you attended it. Families sat down, the television came on, and whatever the anchor said was, for most households, the authoritative account of the day. There was no comment section, no immediate social media response, no army of critics waiting to dissect the broadcast in real time. The anchor was a figure of institutional authority, and that authority carried with it a set of obligations to be accurate, to be fair, to be clear, but also a set of protections. You couldn't fact-check Tom Brokaw in 3 seconds on your phone. You had to trust him, and most people did. That trust was not easily earned. Brokaw and his contemporaries, Peter Jennings at ABC, Dan Rather at CBS, were in constant, fierce competition for the attention and confidence of the American public. The nightly news ratings race was a blood sport, and losing ground even slightly sent shockwaves through the network hierarchies. But that competition, brutal as it was, also produced extraordinary journalism. Because the anchors understood that their authority rested entirely on their credibility, and credibility, once lost, is almost impossible to recover. Brokaw was meticulous about his. In decades of broadcasting, he built a reputation for fairness and rigor that survived the culture wars, the ideological polarization, and the general wreckage that politics inflicted on the media landscape in the late 90s and early 2000s. He has spoken candidly in interviews about the experience of aging, about what it costs to let go of the identity that defined you for 60 years, about the particular strangeness of watching an industry you helped build evolve into something you might not entirely recognize. He does not sound bitter about these things. He sounds like a man who has made his peace with the passage of time, largely because he has had no other choice, and has found in that passage things worth paying attention to. He stepped down from a nightly news anchor chair in December of 2004, handing the role to Brian Williams after more than 2 decades. His final broadcast was a genuine event, the kind of moment that reminded people how much of their lives had been organized around this person's presence. He didn't vanish, of course. He remained a contributor to NBC News, weighing in on major events, appearing as an elder statesman of the craft. But his day-to-day connection to the machinery of daily broadcast journalism had ended, and he watched what happened next from a gradually increasing distance. What happened next was complicated, to put it generously. Savannah Guthrie arrived at NBC News by a route that would have been essentially unrecognizable to Brokaw's generation. She was not, first and foremost, a journalist. She was a lawyer, a serious one, trained at Georgetown University Law Center, who had spent years working in litigation before deciding that the courtroom was not the only arena in which she wanted to operate. When she made the pivot into journalism and eventually into broadcast news, she brought with her a set of skills that are rare in the television environment: the ability to construct and dismantle arguments in real time, the discipline of legal reasoning, the instinct for identifying exactly where a witness, or a politician, is trying to slide past the truth. She worked as a legal correspondent, then as a White House correspondent for NBC News, developing a reputation for incisive, well-prepared interviews that didn't let subjects off easily. She wasn't the kind of reporter who lobbed soft questions and accepted vague answers with a grateful nod. She pressed. She followed up. She had done the work before the interview started, and she expected her subjects to have done theirs. For the political class in Washington, an interview with Savannah Guthrie was not something to be taken lightly. She would smile, and the smile was genuine, but behind it was a lawyer's brain that had already mapped out 3 or 4 moves ahead. She joined the Today show as a co-anchor in 2012, alongside Matt Lauer and Curry. The transition was not seamless. The Today show was an institution unto itself, with its own internal hierarchies, its own rhythms, and its own deeply loyal audience that did not welcome disruption lightly. But Guthrie settled in with a pragmatism that her legal training probably encouraged. She understood that you don't transform an institution by declaring war on it. You transform it by demonstrating, day after day, that you belong there. And she did belong there. Her intelligence translated naturally across the register from White House briefings to morning television. She could do a demanding interview with a senator at 7 in the morning, and then pivot, without apparent effort, to a cooking segment or a discussion about back-to-school shopping. In November of 2017, the world Savannah Guthrie had been carefully building on the Today show was detonated by a news story that hit much closer to home than most. Matt Lauer, her co-anchor and one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television, was fired by NBC News following allegations of sexual misconduct. The news broke in the early hours of the morning, and Guthrie and her co-anchor Hoda Kotb were told about it just before they went on air. There was no time to prepare, no script for this particular situation, no institutional playbook that covered the moment when you have to sit at your desk on live television and tell your audience that the person who sat beside you for years has been dismissed under devastating circumstances. What Guthrie did in those minutes was remarkable, and it was remarkable precisely because it wasn't polished. She was visibly shaken. Her voice wavered. She acknowledged that she was heartbroken and confused, that she was trying to process what she was learning at the same moment the audience was. She did not pretend to a composure she didn't have. She did not retreat into the kind of professional neutrality that earlier generations of anchors had used as a shield against exactly these kinds of moments. She was present. She was human. And she was honest about her own confusion, about the complexity of a situation, about the collision of her professional responsibilities with something that felt deeply personal. It was in hindsight a defining moment, not just for Guthrie personally, but for a certain idea of what broadcast journalism can and should look like in the modern era. Tom Brokaw, in his day, would almost certainly have handled a similar crisis differently. Not worse necessarily, but differently, with more distance, more institutional composure, more of the voice of God register that his generation understood as professionalism. Guthrie chose something different. She chose transparency. She let the audience see exactly where she was, and in doing so, she established a kind of trust that the more formal approach might not have been able to build. She was not reporting about a crisis. She was inside one, and she brought the audience in with her. The show's ratings held. More than held. Guthrie's standing with the audience deepened in the months that followed. Viewers who had known her as the sharp interviewer, the lawyer-turned-anchor, saw something additional. They saw resilience, and they saw genuine feeling. The Today Show entered a period of transition, and Guthrie was at the center of it. She and Hoda Kotb became the anchoring presence that held the franchise together through years that might otherwise have scattered it. They built something between them that felt, to millions of morning viewers, like genuine warmth and genuine partnership. That is harder to manufacture than it looks, and in the case of Guthrie and Kotb, it wasn't manufactured at all. What public figures carry privately is almost always more than the cameras reveal, and both Tom Brokaw and Savannah Guthrie have, in their different ways, made that private weight visible enough for audiences to glimpse. For Brokaw, the reckoning came in 2013 when he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer that attacks the plasma cells in bone marrow. He was 73 years old, long retired from the anchor desk, but still active in the broader conversation about journalism and American public life. The diagnosis was not disclosed publicly at first. Brokaw managed his illness for a year before writing about it himself in a piece for the Washington Post in 2014. In that piece, he described the physical realities of the disease with the same directness he had always brought to difficult stories. No sentimentality, no self-pity, just an honest account of what it felt like to have his body become, as he put, his toughest assignment. He underwent treatment, and he responded well enough to return to a level of activity that surprised his doctors. But the illness changed him in ways that are visible to anyone who has followed his public appearances in recent years. He moves more carefully. He speaks with the consciousness of someone who knows, in a way that younger people generally don't, that the clock is always running.